McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and I'm here with my co-host, Jim Falk.
Always good to see you, Dennis.
Thank you, Jim. And we're going to talk about a program that is just so timely. It's amazing. It's mail-in balloting. We're going to talk about these questions in particular. Is there fraud in U.S. elections? Does that fraud matter? Is it significant? We're going to talk about whether there are special issues or concerns with fraud in mail-in or absentee balloting. We're going to talk about whether there are any post office problems. And then finally, we're going to talk about what happens if mail-in ballots don't all get counted on November 3rd, and what happens if this goes on for days or weeks, and what the likelihood is that an election might be contested. So with that background, Jim, why don't you introduce our great guests?
I will, and I don't know how we're going to do all of that in a half an hour, but let's get started. Because our guests today certainly have a wealth of experience to broaden our understanding on all of these issues. So let me briefly welcome them. Carol Donovan is chair of the Dallas County Democratic Party, a position she has held since 2015. She's been active in the Democratic Party for over 30 years. She's been a precinct chair, convention delegate, donor, and candidate. And one thing I didn't know about Carol Donovan was that when she was a student at the University of Texas at Austin, she was the first woman to be elected student body president. Coming to us from Southern Methodist University is Professor Matthew Wilson, where he specializes in about everything surrounding elections, including public opinion, political psychology, and especially germane to today's discussion, the history of past elections. Hans von Spakovsky manages the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. A part of this work is the managing of Heritage's election fraud database, which tracks instances of fraud across the United States. He's the co-author with John Fund of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. And prior to joining Heritage in 2008, he was a member for 2 years of the Federal Election Commission. Great, I'm so pleased to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. Hans, let me turn to you first. What has your fraud database discovered? And really to the point, especially now, how concerned should we be about the extent of fraud in this year's election?
Well, I guess what I would do is cite a 2008 U.S. Supreme Court decision in which what the court said was that the U.S. unfortunately has a long history of election fraud. It's been documented by journalists and historians, and it could make the difference in a close election. And of course, that's the key to it. It could make the difference in a close election. That's exactly the same thing that the Carter-Baker Commission said. You may recall that election reform commission. They said exactly the same thing. We started a database a couple of years ago. It is not a comprehensive list. A lot of media sources mistakenly look at it that way. It is a sampling of cases from across the country. We've got almost 1,300 proven cases, dozens actually, unfortunately, from Texas, which also has a long history of election fraud.
Over what period of time does your database cover?
It's about the last 20 years, but again, it's not a comprehensive list because there is no one source you can go to find these cases. And frankly, I don't have the resources to do what you would have to do to find all the cases in the country, which is send somebody into every single one of the over 3,000 counties across the country to research their court records and local newspaper records to find these cases. So again, it's just a sampling, a sampling of cases.
Carol, when you hear that, do you agree? How concerned are you?
Well, there's nobody in the United States, credibly, that is going to ever argue that there's no voter fraud at all. But I was concerned a little bit that if it's Spakovsky, is that correct?
You could call me Hans. That's
Hans,
the last name's a little bit tough.
Okay. Well, it did concern me that he very specifically named Democrats committing fraud, but the largest fraud case in the history of the United States was actually run by Republicans in North Carolina. So I think it's, in fairness, we should point out that Republicans have been accused of and convicted of fraud as well. But what does concern me, and I can certainly understand the difficulty in having some kind of comprehensive study, is that in doing the samplings, it doesn't do justice to find out whether or not the fraud is enough to worry about. In Texas, for example, in the last 5 years in the Heritage Foundation's own data, they find that only 5 of the cases that they're looking at deal with voter fraud, and that goes back to 2015. Most of the studies by the Brookings Institute and others will show that the amount of fraud when compared to the amount of votes is only like 0.0004. And I enjoyed the explanation of one of the researchers who said on a 100-mile road, we're dealing with maybe an inch. And that's the way we can look at it.
Okay, Carol, that's a very good way to look at it. By the way, the Stanford study that was done earlier this year said that it is a nonpartisan issue, basically, and you point out that there is mischievousness on both sides of the aisle. Now, Matt, to you about this, we have, while we say it's a small thing, in a large election like the whole presidential election, we think, well, it's millions of votes, et cetera. However, breaking this down into specific districts where there are just a few votes that decide an election, and that might go to the Electoral College, how important is it that all of these votes get counted and counted correctly in all of these particular precincts and congressional districts, especially in those swing states?
Well, of course, it's quite important. And we have to remember that the 2000 presidential election, for example, was decided by 537 votes in one state, in the state of Florida. So it is possible that even something as significant as the presidential election could hinge on quite a small number of votes. Now, that said, it is unlikely, very unlikely, under normal circumstances, that fraud would determine the outcome of an American presidential election. What gives people a little pause this time around, though, is that we're in truly uncharted territory with the massive scope of mail balloting. Right? That's not something we've seen before in an American presidential election. That opens the door to potentially more fraud, more confusion, more maladministration than we've seen in the past. And the critical thing here is not so much the objective question of, did fraud result in a different outcome than we otherwise would have seen? Because that's unlikely, while not impossible. The really important question is whether the American people have confidence in the administration of the election. Do the people on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, feel that whatever outcome is announced is the one that was truly and fairly arrived at? And if there's even a perception that fraud could undermine the outcome of the election, that's a real problem for our democracy.
You know, I think one thing too is, are we really talking about fraud, or do we also need to talk, as the word you used, Matthew, was maladministration? Because so many states are doing this for the very first time, and they don't have the experience that, say, Hawaii or Oregon has had, that has done this for a few election cycles.
Yeah, for me personally, that would be more likely my concern. That is, I suspect that in this election cycle, we will have more issues from just incompetence and maladministration than we will have from intentional fraud. That is, people deliberately setting out to cast illegal ballots, to dispose of or to falsify people's ballots. Undoubtedly, there will be some of that at the margins. What much more concerns me is if the system just breaks down, that states aren't equipped to process the massively increased volume of mail balloting in anything remotely approaching a timely manner. I think that's more likely to throw us into chaos than a large-scale, intentional, nefarious, fraudulent effort would be.
Hans?
Well, it's actually both. And the concern about mail-in ballots and administrative problems is a big concern, and it should be. And I can give you numbers on that. Look, 8 years ago, the New York Times actually wrote an article about absentee ballots. It was written by Adam Liptak. He now covers the Supreme Court. It's a very good article. Let me just give you a very short quote from that article. Votes cast by mail are less likely to be counted, more likely to be compromised, and more likely to be contested than those cast in a voting booth. It is absolutely true that a much larger number of absentee ballots are rejected by election officials for a variety of reasons than votes cast in person. So we are guaranteed to have a higher disenfranchisement rate because so many more people are voting by mail. The Washington Post recently did an article totaling up all the ballots rejected in the primaries this summer, where there was a huge increase. Over 500,000 ballots were rejected. The EAC, that's the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, they file a official report with Congress every 2 years on what happened in the last election. This is based on state survey data. Those reports indicate that in the last 4 federal elections in total, 1.3 million ballots were rejected by election officials. And it's for everything from voters forgetting to sign the ballots, to not providing all the information that's required with an absentee ballot, to the U.S. Postal Service not delivering it on time. And that's the biggest problem with absentee ballots. The more people vote by absentee ballot, the more people's votes are not going to count because of all of these issues.
That sounds reasonable. But Carol, one of the things that seems to make the news is that apparently about 47% of Democrats expect to be able to vote by mail-in ballots, either because of COVID-19 or the usual reasons why they would have absentee ballots, whereas only about 19% of Republicans expect to do this. So does that make this more of a political issue than it would be otherwise?
Well, I would say yes and no. The way that the vote by mail method is structured, there is no partisan bias. And there has never been any evidence that there is. It's a mail ballot. Anybody can use it. But it is true statistically that more Democrats utilize the vote by mail than Republican. And with all due respect to the other speakers on the panel, I would propose that the primary reason why the current president has gone on attack for vote by mail is not because he has evidence of fraud, but it is because he knows that more Democrats vote in that manner. And he knows that twice the number of people in the United States are voting by mail than did in the last presidential election. So to that extent, it does veer towards the partisan aspect.
Carol, you've been on the front lines. You are on the front lines. What are you telling people? What are the monitors, the election supervisors telling people to look out for? And are they well trained?
They are well trained. The election department does a very good job about training voter registrars, about training people handling vote by mail, and of course, the people who are actually out in the field in the polls doing election work. In fact, it's required that poll workers go through that kind of a training. But what I am advising people, a lot of whom are skittish about using the post office. Will my ballot get there in time? They've heard stories about the president having his postmaster general remove sorting machines and other kind of machinery that is necessary for the prompt disposition of mail. And what I tell them is take it to the drop box. Is across town. Unfortunately, there's only one drop box per county, but they could take it themselves to the drop box where there is an election official who will take it and monitor it right there.
Let's stay on that drop box for a minute, if we may. You said there's an election official standing at the drop box?
Yes, there is. The drop box is not open 24 hours. They advertise on the election department website when the drop box will be available. And the reason for that is because they do have it staffed and the person is there to accept the ballot and make sure it's put in without any kind of interference.
Yeah, Matt, your thoughts about that. And also, is there a legitimate issue with the post office, especially because the president appears to have politicized that in some ways.
Well, I would say actually the comments that have been made thus far point to some potential issues that we could face as we tabulate these ballots. So first of all, it would be supremely ironic and from the Democratic standpoint, very unfortunate if the very facts that Hans von Spakovsky notes about the rejection rate for mail balloting actually ends up costing the Democrats hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes, right, because of the higher rate of rejection of mail ballots. Because the polling right now shows that Democrats, and Carol Donovan alluded to this, that Democrats are about twice as likely as Republicans to say that they intend to vote by mail. Well, if they have a much higher rejection rate, those mail ballots, that could cost the Democrats a significant number of votes, potentially in a way that could be decisive in some very close states. This is why I think you've heard some Democratic officials starting to encourage people, well, look, if you can, it would be better if you went and voted in person for some of these same reasons and some of these same concerns. That's one issue. The other issue related to that is that, of course, mail ballots take longer to tabulate. In some states, the election officials are not even permitted to start tabulating them until Election Day. So given the number of people who are going to vote by mail this time, that could take days. Now, you combine that with those partisan differentials in vote in person versus vote by mail that we've been talking about, and we could have a scenario where, based on the votes tabulated on Election Day, it looks like Donald Trump has been reelected as president. But as the mail ballots are slowly tabulated in state by state, slowly but surely, one state after another slips out of the Trump column into the Biden column. Okay, again, it's not guaranteed this is going to happen, but it's a very plausible scenario that this could play out. With what sort of grace and equanimity do you think people on both sides are going to accept that sort of outcome? Right? Those are in short supply in our politics today. And I have a hard time imagining, just to take one person, the president, sitting there and seeing one state after another slide out of his column as the mail ballots are tabulated and accepting that outcome without a fuss. So that could put us in a very dicey situation as we, if in fact we do see that scenario play out in the days and weeks after the election.
Help me understand something. It varies from state by state. So some states are already counting the ballots. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Yes, it varies state by state. The laws as to how those mail ballots can be handled and when and by whom, that's a state by state process.
And that's another reason why I empathize with Hans, because he's dealing with, he's trying to do a scientific study. And it's very difficult when every state has a different method.
And what is really the impact, Carol? I want to ask you this on reducing the number of the ballot boxes from 12, which is what they were in 2016, to just one per county. I mean, we say it's not a partisan issue, but that certainly appears to be one, and is still being fought between the state and the federal government about whether or not we'll only have one ballot box or many more.
That's true. Well, of course, from our standpoint at the Dallas County Democratic Party, we view the reduction of the drop boxes, as they call them, as a very partisan issue. I mean, what does it matter? If all these drop boxes are staffed and there's more than one per county, then it actually makes it more accessible for the voter. So therefore, the reduction of the drop boxes, we believe, is a voter suppression technique.
Hans?
Well, I was just going to say that this just shouldn't be a partisan issue. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether there's actually support for the idea that Democrats vote more with absentee ballots than Republicans. People of both parties vote with absentee ballot, but it is guaranteed that the more people vote by mail, the more people are going to get disenfranchised. New York, in their primary, they rejected 1 in 5 ballots. Can you imagine that? A 20% disenfranchisement rate. And again, it was all kinds of problems and mistakes made by voters, mistakes that don't happen in a polling place, because in a polling place, there's an election official there to remedy problems and answer questions from from voters. And that's an important aspect. When I say I'm encouraging everybody to vote in person, look, that's going to help whether it's a Republican candidate or Democratic candidate. The more people vote in person, the greater the chances their vote is going to count. And that's going to help both candidates. By the way, a standard problem with the US Postal Service, if I can mention this just very quickly, and this has nothing to do with Donald Trump, is look, they've had problems for years. They've been losing money for years. And how bad are they when it comes to election mail? The Inspector General of the Postal Service actually issued a report last November on the 2018 election. And the election, the report was on, did the Postal Service meet its delivery time standards for election mail? That's absentee ballots. You know what their goal was? Their goal was 96%. Not 100%, but 96%. In other words, even if the Postal Service met its on-time delivery goal, that still means 4% of all voters of whatever political party might not have their absentee ballots delivered on time. The report says they came close. 95.6% was their national average for on-time delivery, but they listed 7 states, postal facilities in 7 states that were the worst in the country. And there, the average on-time delivery, they only achieved it 84% of the time. That means 16% of absentee ballots sent in by voters may not have been delivered on time. And that's just one long-term problem with the Postal Service that has been around for many years.
Okay, Hans, you and Carol, I'll go to Carol first. I'd like both of you to weigh in on this. What Matt alluded to, and for the last part of what we're talking about, is what might happen if these things don't get counted in time. And I'm going to give you, it's a Wall Street Journal NBC poll of a week or so ago. And it just says to the American public, do you have confidence that the results of the presidential election will be counted accurately? 45% yes, 45 no, 10 not sure. And then the second question, do you have confidence that votes cast by mail will be counted accurately? 44% yes, 51% no, 5% not sure. So Carol, very quickly, if things don't get counted on time, what do you think the outlook would be for us, and how long could this go on, and how bad could it be?
Well, I agree with Matt that the voters have to have confidence in the results. There's a couple of things with regard to your question, and that is, number one, the post office has had problems for as long as I've been alive. I don't think I've ever gone through any year that I haven't heard complaints about the post office in general. However, according to the Postmaster General's own studies, the post office went severely down this year under his leadership. And so there's definitely some hanky-panky going on just in the past year with this particular postmaster. Second, if vote by mail are being rejected, I have faith that they're being rejected by a partisan group known as the Signature Verification Committee that is back behind the curtain. You don't see them, but it is an organization. It's a group of volunteers that are supervised by the election department along with the ballot board, and they are determining whether or not signatures on vote by mail ballots match. And if they're rejected, then most likely they missed something. And I agree with Hans that there's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross, and that if you're standing there in person in front of an election judge who's trying to help you vote, then the voting process is going to be easier. However, I don't think that we should assume that the vote by mail ballots are going to come out much differently than the general election ballots. And this is the reason. We have an early voting process, the results of which get released at 7 p.m. on election night. And then we have everybody else who votes on election day or vote by mail. And it is amazing, but you can show it to a T. The results of the early voting are almost always the same resolved.
Carol, we have just another minute. I want to ask Hans a real quick question. I wasn't aware of this organization, ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center, which compiles and looks at all the states and tries to see if the voting rolls are accurate. Do you have confidence in their work?
Well, to a certain extent, but states are not doing a very good job of comparing their statewide voter registration list with other states to find individuals who have registered in more than one state. And that's a real problem because we don't have a national voter registration list. States maintain this. But to go back to your original question, just very quickly, look, New York election officials were overwhelmed again in their primary by the huge number of individuals who voted by mail, unlike what they've had before. It took them 6 weeks to count the ballots. If that occurs in other states, if we have the New York primary problem occurring in other states, there could be a long delay if it's a close election. And I think Americans who are used to knowing who's won the presidency, sometimes by the evening of the election, and sometimes, at the most by the next day, if it's taking weeks to do that, I think people will be questioning why that's happening.
Well, we think that's true too, and we're out of time. Matt, thank you. Carol, thank you. Hans, thank you. Jim, always great for you to be here. And remember, there has been voter fraud forever.
Thank you so much for giving Dennis and me the opportunity to bring perspectives that matter to people like you who care, our audience. This has been a very long and challenging, hotly contested presidential election. I don't know who's going to win, nor do you. But one thing for sure, I hope that all of us will vote. It is our right, and we need to do it. To catch up on prior programs, you can always go to McCuistionTV.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel at McCuistion. Always invite you as well to follow us on social media. And thanks so much for watching. Dennis and I will see you on our next program.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.